I'm going to teach you today the secrets of analyzing maps. You need to understand the terrain so that you can build the best possible army list for yourself. If you understand the terrain, you're going to understand how to win the game. This is one of the weirdest, well, maybe not weirdest, but this is one of the least spoken about aspects of Warhammer 40,000 that I have found on the internet. There's a few other, more niche issues, but terrain is fundamental to 10th edition 40k. All of the rules, everything is written under the context of how terrain operates. So if you don't understand how to analyze terrain, then you're going to be on the back foot and your game's going to be suffering quite a bit. So we're going to fix that today. So we're going to go through understanding what makes a map good, in quotation marks, in 40k, depending on your army type. This is so important for list building, especially when you start attending things like tournaments. What you'll do is you need to look at the terrain layouts that are going to happen at the tournament and what primary missions are going to be played on those terrain layouts, to be able to figure out exactly how will your army be able to operate, because some armies might suck at certain tournaments and be amazing at other tournaments based off of how the terrain is laid out. We're going to discuss the difference between Games Workshop Terrain, World Team Championship or WTC Terrain, and the UKTC maps. We're going to focus on their design philosophy and how they will affect shooting and melee armies differently. So basically, we're going to answer the question, which maps are good and which maps are bad. And I'm going to use some examples so I can make sure that everyone learns this very critical skill, very well today. All right. So first off, why do maps matter? They will create strategic impact of terrain on gameplay. All right. There is a massive amount of impact on terrain. Can you deploy on the line? How far back do you need to deploy? Because if you deploy on the line and there are open firing lanes, and I'll show you what I mean by firing lanes in just a moment, then your opponent can just, sit in their deployment zone and blow you away if they go first. And then you just lose the game because your opponent went first. Or they're going to be really good staging points for melee units. So will melee units be able to get up the board without being shot to pieces? Because if you don't have any good staging points, the chances of a melee army doing well on a map are very little. Is there too much terrain? Right? So for example, if there's too much terrain on the board, you might never be able to use your shooting units effectively, which might make shooting neutered. So these things are really, really important when analyzing the maps. The maps are the actual determining factor in where you can stand. And when you know where you can stand on the board, you know what you can shoot, what you can charge. This is a very, very, very important thing. Maps are so powerful, in fact, that they can override army advantages. There might be some armies that have natural advantages into others, but on specific maps, well, they might have a huge advantage or a negative advantage based off the map. The other thing that you want to talk about is what does this map and this primary mission give you? So can you hold an objective safely? Is there a place for your units to stand on one of those critical circles to score primary objectives while standing behind cover so your opponent can't shoot you? That's a very important question to ask. And then you also got to ask, is there an inherent bias to either melee or shooting in 40,000? Well, in Warhammer 40,000. Well, the reality is there is an inherent bias to shooting in Warhammer 40k. That doesn't mean melee is bad. It doesn't mean melee cannot prosper. It totally can, and I think plenty of results have shown that. But there is an inherent bias towards shooting. Shooting has more attacks. Shooting has higher damage, higher strength, higher AP. It's the way it works. Shooting also doesn't need to rely on an additional roll to be able to see if it actually gets to be used. Melee, for example, has to rely on landing a charge before it can be utilized, right? Whereas shooting doesn't need to rely on that. So there is an inherent bias towards shooting. Once again, that does not mean 40k melee is neutered, but it does mean that you have to understand that you have to have the appropriate maps in order to be able to run your melee armies correctly. All right, so let's just get right into Games Workshop maps. And I'm going to give you 3 different examples of a balanced map. I'm going to give you an example of a bias towards melee map, and I'm going to give you an example of a bias towards shooting map. So basically, what are the Games Workshop standard maps? They are really, really good for mixed armies. Basically, you love having durable mid-board control things, okay? The strengths of this is you have very balanced amounts of cover, but it's not overly dense or defensive. So if you look at this map here, for example, let's just pretend this is a search and destroy, and I'll do this on TTS here in a moment to elucidate the point even more. But if this is like a search and destroy, which is the quarter deployment for most of you guys, you would know you have places where you can very safely deploy your units where they're not out in the open, but you're probably not going to be able to safely deploy everything in your army, which means you're going to have to take a little risk that maybe if you want to not put everything in reserves, your opponent might get some firing angles on you in turn 1. So it's good for deployment, but it's not like you can be 100% safe, which is actually a really, really good balanced way to look at things. Basically, the Games Workshop maps really like to encourage engagement and trading units with your opponents, because a lot of these maps, there is really no safe place to hold an objective, although on some of them there are. And when I say safe, what I mean is the objective basically obscured by a line of sight blocking ruin, so that you can stand on the objective and there's a wall in the way so that they can't see you. There are a few of those on Games Workshop maps, but when there are no obscuring ruins on top of the objectives to safely hold it, at least there is what we call a very aggressive staging point, which will allow your melee units to stand in a very threatening position, even if they're not on the objective, that they get to threaten these shooting armies. So it's actually very balanced terrain, and I like it really, really well. I like it a lot. It's definitely the best terrain Games Workshop's ever made. This is the 10th edition terrain. It also works extremely well with the mission pack as is, because all of the deployments are represented and all of the primaries are actually represented as well. Now, there are some considerations you need to have when you're looking at playing on Games Workshop maps. And once I'm done with this, I'm going to show you like examples of what like a good balance, good melee, good shooting is, right? Sometimes GW terrain will punish your aggressive melee armies due to how spread out the terrain can be. And I'm going to show you a really good example of that. Some layouts can make it very hard to safely hold any objectives, but like I said earlier, this is balanced by your generally good staging points. Now, I got some strategic tips for you when you're playing on Games Workshop. A lot of times you'll have open flanks, so you can really pressure hard on the flanks. And what I mean is like running up the sides of the map. And because a lot of times the only time your opponent can shoot you up the sides is if they have their shooting threats in the sides. And if they have their shooting threats in the sides, they typically won't be able to shoot in the middle. So it really forces your opponents to make decisions. So that's why I kind of like Games Workshop maps. Now I'm going to switch to the TTS view here. I'm going to give you an example of 3 maps, and I'm going to show you one that is very balanced, one that is very good for melee armies, and one that is very good for shooting armies, so you can start to get an idea, so that when you analyze your own tournament packs for tournaments that you want to attend, you'll be able to determine how you might want to skew some of your list building options. So let's do this. And huzzah, we did it. All right, so this is the Humble Games Workshop 1 on Hammer Anvil. This is a very, very strong, balanced map. Everyone's going to enjoy this map. It is a very, very reasonable map. It's good for shooting, it's good for melee, and it's good for really encouraging just general good gameplay. The reason for this is you can very safely deploy your entire army on this map, meaning that there's no way that your opponent can really shoot you turn 1 if you're being cagey. This is obviously a very safe place to deploy. You can safely deploy here, 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 here. You can even safely deploy right here, because the only way that your opponent can actually see you is if you cross this line. So maybe let me load in some models here, and I can kind of like demonstrate something for you. All right, so I can actually put a dreadnought on this corner here, and he can be safe in deployment. So even though it looks like he's hanging out in the middle, I obviously don't want to touch the terrain there. This is, if my opponent is wholly within this ruin, which they can do turn 1 if they deploy here, they can get wholly within this ruin, they can actually see through this area. But what I can do is I can just make sure that this ruin will obscure. So as long as I'm behind this line here, and I'm not touching the ruin, my opponent will not be able to see me. So this dreadnought, which even though it looks like he's deployed out in the open, he is 100% safe deploying here, which is kind of cool. So the only way they could see the dreadnought is if they stood here, which basically nothing in the game is going to get from their deployment zone to here in turn 1. It's just almost impossible. Not actually impossible, but it's very, very close to impossible. Like we said, you can obviously easily deploy tanks here. And when a tank is here, sure, it can definitely shoot here, but if you go first and I do this, well, I can't shoot you because you're probably going to be hidden behind this terrain. But in your turn, you can definitely shoot me. So it really encourages us to actually trade and engage with each other. It's very important. Lastly, we've got a spot that is generally safe. Maybe I can just use like infantry to elucidate this point. So if I wanted to take, say, like JPI, and JPI want to stand right here, this is a very relatively safe place to stand. So there might be an angle where your opponent can see you. So if I have a big tank and I'm shooting from here, I actually can't see you. See that? Meaning that they're perfectly safe. And then on this end, even if your opponent is standing right here, they still can't see. So we can just shuffle the models around just ever so slightly. So then they actually can't see you, even if they're standing right here. And that's really important to understand. So there's very, very good staging points, and just for deployment. And then for staging, this is probably the best staging point in all of Warhammer 40,000. And when I say staging, what this tells me is that this model right here, I'm perfectly safe from shooting. I can of course be charged, but from shooting, I'm perfectly safe. And from here, I can basically get this unit wherever I need them to go. They can 100% threaten this objective because it's very easy to get to, even if they're not flying, maybe even if they're just infantry and they walk 6 inches. I can, of course, very obviously easily threaten the center objective. And it's even possible, if they happen to be fast, to threaten this objective. And since these are, jump pack models and they can move 12, they actually can even begin to threaten this objective from staging in the center. Beyond that, they can also threaten up here. So what I've got is the best staging point in the entire game here. Now I've got 3 objectives. The center one, there's basically no protection. You cannot safely hold this objective. It's really, really impossible. Then I've got 2 objectives out here, which are difficult, but not impossible to hold. So if I wanted to, say for example, hold this with my jump pack assault intercessors, while I'm not 100% safe, I am pretty safe. And this is why it's a fairly balanced deployment. And the reason why this is fairly safe is you can't see me from, you can see me from maybe this angle, but that gets really challenging. So the only way you're really going to be able to see me is if you're right here. And this is a dangerous place to be, because the second you're touching right here, now you expose yourself to my shooting right here. Right? So this becomes actually a relatively safe place to hold the objectives, interestingly enough. Now, there is another angle where your opponent might possibly be able to see, but that is very, very challenging. There's no way they're going to be able to see from this. So basically, this is where it's going to come from. So what you see is that, all right, you can hold this objective, and there's only going to be one line of threat. So this is a relatively balanced. It's not perfectly safe for the melee armies to hold these objectives, but it's safe-ish while you have a great staging point. Because remember, if your opponent does come here to shoot you, they instantly die to whatever staged here or to whatever shoots from here. All right, cool. So this is an example of a really balanced terrain. I'm going to show you an example of a very melee-favored terrain. So let me just do this. I'm just going to remove some of these models, and I am going to open up my TTS pack, and I am going to put on GW8. Or heck, you know what? GW7 might actually even be a better point, just so I can show this. This is actually a very, very melee favored map. The reason for that is I can exceptionally safely hold this objective. You guys can see, like, I can obviously deploy safely. This is very safe. There's basically no line where my opponent can shoot through here at all. This is like literally the only one, and that's as extreme as it gets, which means I can be perfectly safe here. I can be perfectly safe here. So the only real line that your opponent's shooting, or line of sight that your opponent can draw, is here. And this goes both ways. So shooting threats are threatened towards each other. Opponents could, however, move through the middle, but that, of course, would expose them. So there's no good places for shooting to really stage on this map. However, there are beautiful places for melee to stage on this map. So if we have, say, the Sanguinary Guard, for example, right here, I hold this objective very safely, and it's very challenging for my opponent to take it from me. Now, they could, of course, come stand right here, but that is a very challenging place to, to take the map off of. Your shooting is never safe. If your shooting does want to move out here to take this line, well, then suddenly I can easily assault you. So this is a very melee-favored map. I'll show you one more little trick about this map, which I like a lot. Your infiltrators actually can deploy even here and be almost perfectly safe, because there's no line for your opponent to actually shoot your infiltrators from right here, which is pretty funny. So even melee armies like going to the opponent's natural expansion instead of just their expansion. All right, so that was a melee favored map, and now I'm going to show you one more. I'm going to show you a very shooting favored map. So let's just delete this terrain, and I will show you a shooting favored map. So I'm going to go and load in GW4. I'm going to put it on Crucible of Battle. So you can just see like the extremes of the differences between melee and shooting armies. So this would be Crucible of Battle GW4. It's a very standard map layout for Games Workshop. And if we look at this, well, honestly, this is a very, very challenging map for melee armies. I can't stand here. There's no way I can stage here, because if I'm standing here, my opponent's going to shoot the crap out of me. And it's too far away for my melee armies to really get to threaten my opponent. These objectives, while they might initially look like, oh, look, you get cover and it's hard to shoot you, it's very easy for your opponent just to move here and shoot anything that's standing on this objective. And obviously, it's very easy to shoot anything that's standing on this objective. So there's no safe place to actually hold an objective on this entire map. You've got no safe map. You don't even have like kind of safe maps. You've got lots of places where your opponent can just destroy you from on all of these objectives. And there's no real ruin to actually safely stage into to actually cross no man's land. So it's kind of just like a bloodbath if you want to play a melee army against a shooting army on this map. So those are really the big differences that we're looking at on our melee maps. Now, just very quickly, I'm going to go through some of the UKTC differences and the WTC differences. I'm not going to go through individual maps. That would just take a little bit too much time. I might do that on a future video if I get some comments down below that saying where you guys are telling me that would be useful for you. If so, then, you know, comment down below and let me know, and I can definitely take a look at doing that. So let's go back to the PowerPoint here. I'm going to kind of finish elucidating my points here. Okay, so those were Games Workshop maps. Let's talk real quickly about WTC maps. If you haven't seen WTC maps, that's what most of our teams leagues generally play on. In the World Teams Championship, that is what, you know, WTC stands for. That's what we play for like national teams when we all go to. It used to be Belgium. This year it's going to be Austria for our biggest competition every single year. So basically you have denser terrain than you do in Games Workshop, and it's a very high skill format. There are lots of shooting lines on these maps, but they really require very precise positioning. There are also tend to be more terrain, which can limit the way that your people can move through the maps. So if you have things like land raiders on some of the WTC maps, there is literally nowhere for a land raider to actually move. So it can be restrictive of movement for very, very large models. And it can be generally slightly friendlier to melee armies than your Games Workshop terrain is. That doesn't mean that melee armies just run roughshod in WTC, far from it, but it does mean a lot of times in WTC terrain, your melee armies have a little bit of a buff. So there's lots of obscuring terrain, tons of staging areas, but it really does encourage your tight movement, trading, close combat. It does not, however, and this is a big problem with the WTC terrain, it doesn't work well with the current mission pack. As a matter of fact, there are actually 0 Dawn of War or Sweeping Engagement layouts on all of WTC terrain. It's because it's not designed for those layouts in mind. It limits long-range shooting effectiveness sometimes, but it does reward high-speed shooting, and it can limit where certain models can move, like we just mentioned. So one of the things that you always want to do on WTC maps is you always want to prioritize speed and your counter deployment tricks, because a lot of times there's bottlenecks here where it's very easy to block your opponents. Let's talk about UKTC, and then we'll start wrapping this up. So UKTC maps. These are actually a little bit weird. And I mean, if you play in UKTC, it's not weird, obviously. But if you don't play in UKTC, and for those of you who don't know, that would be like, I think it's the United Kingdom's tournament circuit. I think that's what the letters stand for. But it's played in England. So it's a fixed layout, and you typically have large L-shaped ruins and an open center. You also have some slightly different shaped ruins. So if you see on this little demonstration I have here, there's actually not really big base plates for the terrain for blocking line of sight. It's kind of almost just the terrain itself. So these maps tend to be very, very good for our shooting heavy and our very, very fast armies. And that's why you'll see different style of armies do better on UKTC maps versus WTC versus GW. It's going to be kind of funny like that. You have very clean sight lines from deployment zones. So I can kind of draw the lines for you, but I don't know if you can see actually see my mouse. So, all right, you can't see my mouse here. But basically, there are definitely places on here where you can just draw a line of sight from your opponent's deployment zone to your deployment zone. So you can just not move and just see your opponent's army. So it really does favor a lot of go first and shoot hard. Of course, nothing's really that simple in Warhammer, but that's the general problem. There's very few very safe staging points. So on this map, for example, you can see the natural expansion has a safe staging point, but the others, you're never going to be able to hold them safely at all, and it can just be very, very friendly to shooting armies. So melee armies will tend to struggle to cross midfield. However, extremely fast melee armies tend to do really well on UKTC, because UKTC does also have some decent staging into the center fields occasionally, but it's almost never on our objectives. So the other weird thing about UKTC is they don't use the mission pack. They really are bad with the mission pack, and they have a very specific order of events. So there's no randomness in the actual maps that you're playing. So every single UKTC event will follow the exact same mission map. So round 1 will always be sweeping engagement, terraform, swift action. Round 2 will always be crucible, purge the foe, smoke and mirrors. Round 3 will always be search and destroy, take and hold hidden supplies. Round 4, search and destroy, linchpin, prepared positions, and you guys can just kind of read the rest. So every single tournament you go to will be exactly the same, which I personally find very boring. That doesn't mean it sucks. That doesn't mean, different strokes for different folks, but I find that exceptionally boring. So that's the UKTC design. So basically, guys, choosing the right army for the map is really, really important. What I highly recommend you do is you take some of the lessons and some of the thoughts that we talked about in this video when you're analyzing the tournament that you want to go to, and I want you to think, does my melee army like this these 5 or 6 or whatever missions that are in this tournament. Because if they don't, because there's no good staging room and there's no way to safely cross no man's land, maybe I need to consider more of a shooting army for this style of, for these particular layouts. And it's really, really important. So let me know if you have more questions about this. I can go through more in depth some of the UKTC maps versus some of the WTC maps if there is a significant amount of interest. So let me know in the comments down below. And if you had any other thoughts, also let me know, because I'm really curious to hear what you guys think. With that, I am going to take off for the day. I hope all of you have an amazing freaking day, and I'm really excited because I'll be gone this weekend. I'm going to be the head judge of a big tournament in Sweden, and that's going to be an absolute blast. So shout out to those guys, and you guys will be getting some content from that event, and I think you're going to enjoy it. So with that, I'm going to take off. Crump on. Have a lovely freaking day. Bye-bye.